They called me the useless one. The quiet daughter who never mattered. That's what my father said last Christmas when he toasted to the one child who carries the Carter legacy. He raised his glass toward my sister Victoria, while 200 guests applauded inside our oceanfront mansion in Newport. The crystal chandeliers reflected off champagne and ambition, and every cheer sounded like an echo of my invisibility. I stood by the window clutching my glass of cheap rosé, smiling like it didn't sting. When Victoria laughed, the sound was crisp, practiced the sound of a woman who'd never been denied anything. Then the doorbell rang, cutting through the classical music. A mailman stood outside the glass doors, his uniform soaked from coastal rain. "Delivery for Emily Carter," he said, holding a single envelope sealed with red wax. My father's seal, the one from Carter Instruments, the company he'd built before I was even born. Silence rippled through the room. My mother's face tightened. Victoria tilted her head, smiling with that cruel curiosity only she could manage. I took the envelope, the wax glinting under the chandelier, and read the handwriting on the front, "To Emily, to be opened when they all gather." The air felt heavier after that. Conversations stalled, the violinist hesitated mid-note. My father cleared his throat, the sound sharp. "Probably some leftover paperwork," he said, trying to sound amused, but his eyes wouldn't meet mine. I turned the envelope over in my hand, feeling the raised wax. My mother reached out, her smile too wide. "Darling, you can open it later. Don't make this about you." But the room was already watching. 100 expectant faces waiting for me to sit down, stay quiet, fade into the background like I always did. So I did what no one expected. I broke the seal. The paper inside was thick, folded twice. The handwriting was unmistakable. My father's. I unfolded it slowly, my heart pounding in my throat. The first line read, "If you're reading this, then the truth can no longer wait." The room froze. My father's voice cracked. "That's enough, Emily." Victoria laughed softly. "What truth, Dad?" she asked, her voice dripping with mock concern. He glared at her, then at me, and for the first time in my life my father looked afraid. The party had begun like every other celebration in our family, lavish, self-congratulatory, and built entirely around Victoria. It was her 29th birthday, the golden child's annual coronation. The living room looked like a magazine spread, orchids imported from Singapore, a champagne fountain taller than me, and a cake sculpted like a miniature of the Carter Instruments headquarters in Portland. Our guests were CEOs, board members, and family friends who spoke in profits and partnerships. My mother glided through them like a queen at court, proud of her perfect family, one daughter brilliant, one daughter forgettable. Everywhere I looked, there were reminders of the divide. The grand piano in the corner bore a gold plate engraved, "Presented to Victoria Carter for excellence in leadership." Across the room, a portrait of her hung beside my father's, their smiles identical. My own photo, a small frame from my college graduation, was half hidden behind a vase. Even my name had been omitted from the engraved invitation. I'd only been added later in pen, afterthought, neat and polite. When my mother introduced us to guests, she used different tones for each of us. "This is Victoria, CEO of Carter Instruments. Brilliant, relentless, the future of our company." Then her voice softened into condescension when she reached me. "And this is Emily, our artistic one. She teaches music to children. Isn't that sweet?" The woman beside her smiled, the kind of smile people reserve for lost causes. "How noble," she said, as if I'd chosen poverty for sport. My mother nodded. "She's always had such a kind heart, even if she never quite fit the Carter mold." I smiled through it like always. I'd learned long ago that silence could be armor. But tonight something inside me stirred. Maybe it was the way my father called Victoria, the one who keeps our name alive. Maybe it was the sight of him handing her the keys to a Porsche wrapped in a gold ribbon. Or maybe it was that letter heavy in my hand, burning like a secret I wasn't supposed to hold. When the applause died down after his toast, I slipped toward the back of the room. The sea wind pressed against the glass waves, crashing in rhythm with my pulse. My reflection stared back at me, 32 plain dress teacher's salary, forgotten daughter of a family obsessed with prestige. My sister's laughter floated through the air like perfume. Dad, tell them about the Seattle expansion, she said. He obliged, proud and booming, while I stood in the corner like part of the wallpaper. A friend of hers approached me, a man in a gray suit, with a drink too expensive for my taste. So, Emily, what do you do again? He asked. Teach piano to toddlers. Before I could answer, my mother appeared. She works at a public school, she said, lowering her voice as if confessing a crime. Such a humble job. The man smiled politely. Well, someone has to start them young. They both laughed. I excused myself before the sound of it cracked me open. In the hallway, the lights were dimmer. The only sound was the sea outside and the muffled chatter from the ballroom. I turned the letter in my hands again, my fingers tracing the red seal. To be opened when they all gather. Why would my father write that he wasn't sentimental, and certainly not dramatic? If anything, he avoided direct words. His affection had always been measured in silence and avoidance. The man who once told me art doesn't pay bills, Emily, would never write something like that without purpose. Behind me, the glass doors opened. Victoria stepped out, still holding her champagne. You really had to make an entrance, didn't you? She said, her tone light but sharp. Even your letters have to ruin my party. I didn't send it, I said quietly. She laughed. Oh, come on. It's probably just Dad, leaving you a sympathy note. Something to make you feel useful. She sipped her drink, eyes glinting. You really shouldn't embarrass yourself in front of investors. We have an image to maintain. I'm not the one who's embarrassed, I said before I could stop myself. Her smile faltered for half a second before she shrugged. Suit yourself. Just remember who signs your Christmas checks. She turned back toward the crowd, the heels of her shoes clicking like punctuation marks in a sentence about power. I stayed behind, my heart pounding, the weight of the envelope pressing into my palm like a promise. When I returned to the ballroom, everyone had gathered near the piano for speeches. My father stood beside Victoria, one arm around her shoulders, pride radiating off him like heat. My mother clasped her hands dramatically. To the daughter who carries her father's fire, she said, and the one who carries his heart. A few polite chuckles followed, though no one was sure if that second part was meant as praise or pity. I slipped quietly to the back, but my father's voice boomed across the room. Emily, why don't you come up here for a picture? I hesitated. He didn't wait for an answer. It'll make your mother happy. The guests parted as I walked forward, clutching the envelope like it might steady me. I stood beside Victoria. She leaned closer and whispered, Don't stand too close. The camera might catch your side job. The flash went off. I blinked, blinded for a second, but even through the white light I saw it, the nervous flicker in my father's eyes when he glanced at the letter. The music resumed. People went back to laughing, drinking, pretending everything was perfect. But my world had already shifted. The letter felt alive in my hand, humming with every breath I took. My mother called from across the room, Emily, be a dear, and take the family photo down to the study. I nodded, moving toward the staircase. But halfway there, I stopped. I unfolded the letter again, ignoring the voices, the music, the judgment pressing around me. My father's words stared up at me from the page, simple and devastating. If you're reading this, it means the truth can no longer wait. I looked up slowly, and the moment my father saw the letter open in my hand, his glass slipped from his fingers and shattered on the marble floor. Victoria's smile froze mid-laugh. The crowd turned toward me, and in that silence, sharp, shimmering, expectant, I realized something I'd never seen before. For the first time in my life, my father looked afraid of me. The storm had quieted by the time I left the mansion that night, but my hands still shook as I drove back to Newport. The letter sat on the passenger seat beside me, folded neatly as if containing it could stop the chaos it carried. My father's words echoed in my head, the truth can no longer wait. I replayed his face in that moment, the fear that replaced arrogance, and my mother's quick attempt to laugh it off. Somewhere between the ocean and the dark road, I realized that something irreversible had cracked open. The next morning, the sun spilled through my window like it didn't know what had happened. I sat at the kitchen table in my small apartment, surrounded by chipped mugs and unpaid bills, trying to piece together what last night had meant. My phone buzzed a message from my mother. "Do not speak of that letter to anyone. It was an old draft. You misunderstood." I almost laughed. Even her text sounded like commands wrapped in politeness. Beneath it was a second message from Victoria. "You really can't help yourself, can you? Always have to make everything dramatic." I didn't answer either of them. Silence had always been my safest response. The coffee tasted bitter, and for a moment I closed my eyes, letting memories rush in the mansion, the piano, the way my mother's voice used to float down the hallway when she was still kind. That was before the comparisons began. Before everything I did was measured against Victoria. I could still hear her voice in my head, the question that shadowed my entire childhood. "Why can't you be more like your sister?" I was 12 when I realized the question wasn't meant to be answered. It was a sentence disguised as curiosity. My sister was 9 then, and already a prodigy. She'd mastered the piano by 10, spoke fluent French by 11, and had a plaque in the hallway that read "Future CEO." I, on the other hand, painted on the garage walls with chalk and sang in the backyard when I thought no one was listening. My father used to say I was a sweet distraction. My mother called me our little dreamer, which in her mouth sounded like an insult dressed in pearls. The first time I ever made him proud was an accident. I'd won a state art competition for designing a community mural when I was 16. He came to see it after work, still in his tailored suit, his phone pressed to his ear. I waited for him to look at it to see what I'd done. He glanced at it once and said "nice colors" before walking away. I stood there watching his car pull out of the lot, the mural reflected in its glossy finish. That was the day I learned approval was currency in our house, and I was broke. Victoria's success stories became the family anthem. Every dinner, every gathering, every guest conversation began and ended with her. When she got into Stanford, there was a catered celebration. When she graduated, my mother wore diamonds and hired a string quartet. When I graduated from Oregon State with a degree in music education, my parents sent flowers with a note that said, "Proud of your persistence. Not proud of your talent. Not proud of your work. Proud of your persistence," as if I'd survived something rather than achieved it. It wasn't that I resented her accomplishments. I just resented being invisible next to them. But resentment, like salt water, only corrodes the vessel that holds it. So I built a life away from theirs. I moved into a small studio apartment overlooking the bay, took a teaching job at Newport Elementary, and filled my days with the sound of off-key children learning to find rhythm. The walls were painted with handprints and the smell of tempera paint. My paycheck barely covered rent, but I loved every chaotic second of it. The laughter of 20 kids learning their first chords was worth more to me than any boardroom title. Still, my parents saw it as failure. My father once said during Thanksgiving dinner, "It's noble that you want to help children, Emily. But nobility doesn't build empires." My mother added, "Maybe if you taught private lessons, it would sound less volunteer workish." Victoria, sitting beside me with a glass of champagne, smirked and said, "We can't all be executives, right?" I'd forced a smile then, but I remember thinking how strange it was that people who measured success by wealth looked so empty when they laughed. I moved out completely after that Thanksgiving. My mother called it a dramatic exit. My father called it a phase. Victoria didn't call at all. I furnished my place with second-hand furniture, painted the walls pale blue, and bought a used upright piano from a thrift store. The keys were chipped, but when I played it felt like freedom. I started the Harmony Club for kids whose families couldn't afford lessons. We met after school in the art room, surrounded by drawings taped to the walls. We didn't have much, but it was ours. One of my students, a boy named Mason, gave me a note that said, "Music makes me feel safe." I kept it in my wallet for years. It wasn't until recently that I began hearing from my parents occasional calls when they needed to fill a seat at some family function or to remind me about Victoria's latest achievement. I always went, not for them, but for the faint memory of my grandfather's voice telling me when I was little, Grace isn't about applause. It's about persistence when no one claps. He died when I was 20. He was the only one who saw me as more than a shadow. When I walked into that mansion for Victoria's birthday, it was his words that echoed in my mind. Maybe that's why I opened the letter. Maybe I wanted to prove that his faith hadn't been misplaced. That morning, after reading my mother's message, I went for a walk along the shoreline. The sea air bit at my skin, the tide pulling against the rocks in a steady rhythm like a heartbeat I'd forgotten I had. I thought about the letter and what it meant for my father to send it now when the family had already written me off. I thought about the look in his eyes, fear, guilt, maybe even regret. And beneath all that I thought about the one line, the truth can no longer wait. What truth? About the company, about me, about him. When I returned home, there was a package leaning against my door wrapped in brown paper, my name written in neat handwriting. Inside was a photo, old sepia-toned, of my father standing beside a man I didn't recognize, labeled Harold Winters, legal advisor. A note was tucked behind it. He knows everything. My chest tightened. I turned the photo over again, staring at the faint signature of my father on the back, the same looping cursive that signed the letter. I sat on the couch for a long time, the waves humming through the open window. Every instinct told me to ignore it, to return to the safety of my quiet life. But something deeper, something older told me not to. I thought about Victoria's smirk, my mother's condescension, my father's trembling hands. There was something they were hiding, something that frightened them enough to pretend it didn't exist. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't afraid to find out why. That night, I received a call from an unknown number. When I answered, a deep, measured voice spoke. "Miss Carter, my name is Harold Winters. I was your father's attorney." My breath caught. "He asked me to contact you when you opened that letter." I swallowed hard. Why now? There was a pause on the line long enough to make the silence feel alive. "Because Emily," he said softly, "it's time you learned why they've called you useless all these years. It was never about you." The line went dead. I sat there, phone still against my ear, the city quiet outside, the sound of rain beginning to fall against the window. For years I had believed my insignificance was my fault. But that night, as thunder rolled over the Pacific, I began to realize something else. Maybe being the useless one wasn't a curse. Maybe it had been protection all along. The sound of rain tapping against the window woke me before sunrise. The world outside was still half asleep, the ocean wrapped in fog, the sky the color of pewter. I sat up slowly, the phone still on the nightstand from last night's call. Harold Winters, my father's attorney. The man whose name had appeared in that photograph like a whisper from the past. I brewed a pot of coffee, but the bitterness only deepened the knot in my stomach. On the counter sat the envelope I hadn't yet dared to move, still sealed again, after I'd folded it back with trembling hands. The words "he knows everything" clung to me. I'd spent so long trying not to know anything, trying to build a small, quiet life where their opinions couldn't reach me. But the truth had knocked once, then twice, and I knew if I ignored it again, it would tear the door off its hinges. At 8, I pulled on my coat and walked to the school. The building was still dark, except for the janitor's cart parked in the hallway. Inside the music room, instruments lay scattered from yesterday's class. Tiny violins, missing strings, cracked tambourines, an old upright piano with 3 sticky keys. I opened the windows, letting the salt air in, and sat down at the piano. The first chord that came out was flat, dull, and human. It matched how I felt. By the time the children arrived, the room had filled with the smell of wet coats and laughter. 20 small voices bouncing off the walls, the chaos I loved most. "Good morning, Miss Carter," they shouted, and for the first time that day I smiled without trying. These kids didn't know who my family was, or what that name meant. They didn't care about fortunes or business empires or public image. To them, I was just Miss Carter, the lady with the paint on her sleeves who made them believe every wrong note still belonged in the song. We started with warm-ups. "Breathe and count to 4, and sing it like you mean it," I said. Little voices rose unevenly, some sharp, some soft, all beautiful in their imperfection. One of my students, Liam, the boy who'd been too shy to speak a few months ago, sang the loudest. When he finished, the class clapped and he hid behind his hands, grinning. His mother had once told me he hadn't spoken for nearly 2 years after his father left. Music had brought him back to words. Every time I saw him smile, it felt like winning something no one could ever buy. After class, the parents came to pick them up. One mother, Mrs. Alvarez, squeezed my hand. "You're changing lives here," she said. "Thank you for believing in them." Her gratitude caught me off guard. I wasn't used to hearing thank yous that sounded like prayers. "I believe in them, because someone once believed in me," I said, though I wasn't sure if that was true anymore. When the last child left, I stayed behind cleaning brushes, tuning the piano, straightening chairs. The hum of the radiator filled the silence. I looked around the empty room and thought of my father's company, its glass offices, endless board meetings, the way he used to talk about productivity, as if it were a religion. Here in this small school, everything he dismissed as weakness, patience, empathy, imperfection was what kept the music alive. Maybe that was what he never understood. Maybe that was what terrified him. At lunch, my colleague Marcy found me in the teacher's lounge, sketching lesson plans on napkins. "You look tired," she said, handing me a cookie. "Rough night." Something like that. "Family," I laughed softly. "When isn't it?" Marcy raised an eyebrow. "You know, for someone who hates her family, you talk about them a lot." "I don't hate them," I said. "I just don't belong to them." She smiled knowingly. "Then build your own." That evening, after everyone had gone home, I walked to the post office to send permission slips for our upcoming concert. The clerk, an older man named Jerry, greeted me with his usual nod. "Evening, Miss Carter." "Oh, almost forgot there's something here for you. Came in yesterday." He reached behind the counter and handed me a thick envelope stamped with an old-fashioned seal, W&W Legal Services, Portland. My breath caught. I took it outside, the wind pushing against me. Under the streetlight, I broke the seal. Inside was a short handwritten note on firm stationery. "Miss Carter, if you've found my name, it's time we talk. I promised your father I'd reach out only when you opened his letter. Meet me Friday, 2 p.m. Harbor Cafe. H.W." The note trembled slightly in my hands. It wasn't fear. It was the feeling of gravity shifting, like standing at the edge of a drop you can't yet see. I looked up at the night sky, dark and salt-scented. For years, my life had been small by choice, safety disguised as contentment. But that safety had always been built on silence, and silence, I was learning, was just another kind of prison. The next day at school, I caught myself distracted. During class, I forgot to cue the drums, left my coffee on the piano, called a student by the wrong name. The kids didn't notice, they just laughed, filling the air with noise that reminded me life was still happening around me. During break, I stepped outside. Across the street, a delivery truck passed its radio, playing a familiar jingle, Carter Instruments, where sound becomes art. I flinched. Even here, even in this quiet town, their name followed me like a ghost. That night, I sat at my kitchen table with my old photo albums spread around me. My childhood fit neatly into 2 categories: Victoria's achievements and my absence. There were pictures of her shaking hands with politicians, winning piano competitions, cutting ribbons at company events. And there was me, somewhere out of frame, always the shadow. I flipped through until I found one photo that didn't fit, the 3 of us with my father standing outside his workshop. I must have been around 9. He was smiling at me, not at Victoria, not at the camera, but at me. A faint, proud, secret smile. I stared at it for a long time before sliding it into my purse. Friday came too fast. The morning was clear, the sea calm, as if pretending nothing waited beneath. I dressed simply a navy sweater, jeans, no makeup, and walked toward the harbor. The cafe sat near the docks, the kind of place fishermen stopped for coffee before dawn. Inside, the smell of salt and burnt espresso hung in the air. An old clock ticked above the counter. He was already there. Harold Winters. A tall man with silver hair, posture like a soldier, eyes sharp but kind. He stood when I approached, extending his hand. "Miss Carter," he said. His voice was steady, but there was something behind it, a weight of years. "Mr. Winters," I replied. "You said you knew my father." "I did," he said, gesturing to the chair across from him. "Very well." I sat down, my pulse steadying only because I forced it to. "Why now? Why after all this time?" He folded his hands. "Because your father asked me to wait until the family tried to erase you." My throat went dry. "Erase me?" He nodded slowly. He knew it would happen. He knew the moment he passed, the balance of that household would tilt in one direction. What direction? "The one that forgets kindness when it counts the least," he said. Then he reached into his briefcase and pulled out a leather-bound folder. "And he left this for when you were ready to remember." I didn't open it. Not yet. I just stared at it, feeling the weight of everything I'd tried to bury pressing back up from the ground. The past wasn't done with me. It had simply been waiting for me to look it in the eye. When I left the cafe, the wind had picked up, carrying the scent of salt and rain. The folder sat heavy in my arms as I walked along the docks. For years I'd been defined by what I wasn't: unambitious, unremarkable, unneeded. But the truth, whatever it was, had found me anyway. And this time, I wasn't going to turn away. The harbor cafe was nearly empty, except for the hiss of the espresso machine and the sound of gulls circling outside. Harold Winters sat across from me with a cup of black coffee untouched in front of him. The leather folder he'd brought lay between us like a sleeping animal neither of us dared to wake. The man looked older than in the photograph I'd seen, but his eyes were clear, deliberate, the kind of eyes that didn't waste words. "You look just like your father when he first came to see me," he said quietly. "That's not necessarily a compliment," I replied. He smiled faintly. "No, I suppose it isn't. He was stubborn, brilliant, and a terrible listener. So he didn't change much," I said. "No, but he learned. And you're here because of that." He tapped the folder lightly. "This is what he wanted you to have when the family finally crossed the line." I stared at the embossed initials WC on the cover. Crossed the line, how Harold folded his hands. By taking what wasn't theirs. By rewriting his story before it was finished. "My father was never one for unfinished stories," I said. "That's why he left you this," Harold said. He opened the folder carefully, revealing a single envelope sealed with red wax identical to the one I'd opened days ago. Beneath it lay several pages of typed documents stamped Amendment B, Carter Instruments Legacy Plan. I touched the envelope but didn't open it. "You're telling me my father changed his will, not just the will," he said. "The structure of his legacy." He called it the Integrity Clause. The words sounded heavy, deliberate. What does that mean? "It means," Harold said, "that he decided the Carter name would stand for more than money." I laughed under my breath. "You realize how ridiculous that sounds?" "I do. And yet that's exactly what he intended." He slid one page toward me. On the top, written in my father's unmistakable handwriting, was a note to my daughter who builds harmony where others build noise. My chest tightened. Harold continued, "Your father admired what you did, Emily. The music programs, the community work. He said you carried the part of him that still believed in creation over control." I couldn't speak for a moment. He never said anything, not once. He wasn't good at words, but he left plenty of proof. Harold opened another folder and took out a photograph. It showed my father sitting in the back row of a school auditorium. I was on stage conducting a group of children at our annual recital. I remembered that day. It had been raining, and the lights flickered through the performance. I hadn't known he was there. Seeing the picture felt like finding an old heartbeat. He came to see you more than once, Harold said softly. He told me, Emily's classroom is more honest than my boardroom. I swallowed hard, staring at the photo until it blurred. Then why didn't he ever say that to me? Because your mother wouldn't have let him. The name hit the air like a stone dropped in still water. Harold leaned back. Sylvia was persuasive. She believed image was everything. When your father tried to support your music program financially, she blocked it. Said it made the family look divided. That sounds like her, I said bitterly. She convinced him to keep it secret to protect you, he said. He didn't want Victoria using your life as another measure of failure. I felt my throat tighten. He kept secrets to protect me. Yes, and to protect what he called the part of the family worth saving. Harold took a sip of coffee that had gone cold. Your father saw the way things were heading, the greed, the ambition. He created an alternate legacy plan separate from the company's assets. If the others ever tried to disinherit you or manipulate his estate, this amendment would override the rest. I stared at him, stunned. Override how? By activating what he called the Truth Clause. It gives you oversight of all Carter Foundation funds and the right to audit any use of company resources related to philanthropy. I almost laughed. I teach second graders. I can't run a corporation. Harold's gaze was steady. He didn't want you to. He wanted you to guard its heart, not its numbers. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the cafe windows. I traced the edge of the paper with my fingers. My mother and sister, they won't accept this. They don't have to, he said. The law will. I stared at him, my pulse loud in my ears. What happens if I do nothing? Then they win. They'll keep using the Carter name for profit and vanity, and everything he tried to protect will rot from the inside. I looked down at my hands. What if I can't handle it? Harold's voice softened. He believed you could. He said Emily doesn't build empires. She builds harmony. And harmony lasts longer. For a long moment we sat in silence, the kind that stretches but doesn't break. The letter in front of me felt heavier than before. I thought he didn't care, I whispered. He cared enough to plan for this day, Harold said. He just didn't live long enough to see it. Rain streaked the window beside us. The cafe owner turned up the radio and a soft piano melody filled the room. It reminded me of the lullabies my father used to hum when I was a child before business, and expectation took him away. Your father wanted you to have this too, Harold said, pulling out another envelope. This one was smaller, thinner, the paper aged yellow at the edges. He wrote it the night before he signed the amendment. I hesitated, then opened it. The letter was brief. If you're reading this, it means they've tried to silence you again. Don't let them. The world needs builders of hearts, not destroyers of names. Signed simply Dad. I pressed the paper to my chest as if that could steady the shaking inside me. He knew this would happen, I said quietly. He did, Harold replied. And he wanted me to help you when it did. I met his eyes. Help me how? By making sure they don't bury this again. He tapped the folder. You'll need to bring this to the board meeting next week. It's the annual Carter Instruments celebration when they announce the next phase of expansion. If they exclude you, the clause activates automatically. Activate, I repeated, meaning he said calmly, you become the acting trustee of the Carter Foundation. I stared at him. That's insane. Not if you think like your father. He wanted them to expose themselves first. He knew they would. So I just show up. You show up, Harold said. And you stay silent until it's time to speak. He pushed the folder toward me. They'll deny everything. But this is the document that will change everything they think they control. I stared at the folder but didn't reach for it. What if I open it and find out I'm not ready? Harold smiled faintly. You already opened one letter you weren't ready for. And you survived that. Outside, the rain had turned to mist. The light through the windows softened. I finally picked up the folder, the leather cool against my palms. What happens after I show them this? Harold looked out at the harbor before answering. Then, my dear, we see what kind of music truth makes. When I left the cafe, the world smelled like salt and new beginnings. The folder felt like a live pulse against my side. I walked along the dock, the gulls calling overhead, my reflection flickering in the water below. For years I'd believed silence was safety, that staying small would keep me whole. But my father had seen something else, something worth fighting for. The tide rolled and breaking against the wooden posts, steady and unstoppable. I took a deep breath and whispered to no one, "I'll show up." The wind carried the words out to sea, where they disappeared into the gray horizon. But I knew they'd find their way back. Truth always does. The morning fog clung to the cliffs as I drove back to the mansion. The tires hissed on wet pavement. And the letter from Harold Winters sat on the seat beside me, the leather folder tucked safely beneath it. My stomach turned every few seconds like it wanted to escape what I was about to do. The Carter estate loomed ahead, its white columns stark against the gray sky. I hadn't been back since the night of the party. Now it felt less like a home and more like a battlefield. My mother opened the door before I could knock. She wore silk even at 9 a.m, her hair perfect, her eyes sharp as glass. "You came back," she said, her voice brittle. "I didn't think you'd have the nerve." "I need to talk to you," I said. She crossed her arms. "If it's about that ridiculous letter, save your breath." "It's not ridiculous," I said. "It's real. Dad wrote it, and there's more. There's a clause in his amendment, something called the integrity clause." Her lips thinned. "Amendment," she repeated like it was a dirty word. "Yes. He filed it with Harold Winters, his attorney." Her posture stiffened, but she tried to recover. "Harold Winters was dismissed years ago. Your father said he was senile." "Funny," I said. "He didn't seem senile when he showed me the documents your husband signed." Her smile cracked for just a second. "You don't know what you're talking about, Emily." "I do," I said. "And you do too. You just hoped I'd stay quiet like always." She stepped closer, lowering her voice. "Do you realize what you're doing? You're dragging your father's name through the mud for attention." "I'm dragging it out of the mud," I said. "You buried it there." The slap of her hand against my face was quick, almost delicate. I didn't move. I just stared at her until she looked away. "You've lost your mind," she whispered. "Maybe," I said, "but at least I haven't lost my soul." From behind us came the sound of heels clicking on marble. "What's going on?" Victoria's voice slid through the hallway like smoke. She appeared at the top of the staircase in a fitted blazer and heels the portrait of confidence. "Oh, it's you," she said, her eyes flicking toward the folder in my hand. "You still chasing fairy tales?" I turned toward her. "You should probably hear this too." She descended the stairs, slowly savoring the tension. "I already heard you embarrassed yourself with Dad's old lawyer." "He gave me proof," I said. "Proof that Dad's will wasn't what you think it was." Victoria laughed. "Please. You really think Dad would trust you with anything important? You couldn't even manage a college fundraiser without crying." "I'm not here to fight," I said. "I'm here to show you what he left behind." I placed the folder on the coffee table, opening it to reveal the notarized amendment. The red seals gleamed under the chandelier. My mother's hand twitched. Victoria leaned forward, her laughter dying in her throat. "What is this amendment be?" I said quietly. "Signed and sealed by Dad, witnessed by Judge Collins, and notarized. It includes a clause that activates if the family ever tries to erase me from his estate." Victoria scoffed, but there was a crack in her voice now. "Erase you? No one erased you, Emily. You erased yourself. You left." "I left because you made sure I had no place here. You made your choices," she snapped. "We made ours." "Exactly," I said. "And one of those choices was pretending I didn't exist." My mother reached for the papers. "Give me that," she said. I pulled them back. "No, you've hidden enough." Her voice rose, breaking its polished calm. "This is nonsense. Your father left everything to the one who could handle responsibility." I looked her dead in the eye. "He changed his mind." Victoria snatched the top page, scanning the lines. Her face paled as she read the phrase, "the integrity clause." She threw the document down. "This is fake," she said. "Some old man forged it to make himself feel relevant." "Then call your lawyer," I said. Because the court will see the original copy. For the first time, neither of them had an answer. The silence between us was thick, broken only by the distant sound of the sea beyond the windows. I could see it on their faces, the flicker of fear my father must have once seen too. My mother straightened her spine, her voice trembling with false calm. "Do you have any idea what kind of damage you're doing to this family? Do you?" I asked. "Do you have any idea how it felt to be told I was worthless while you handed her everything?" Victoria stepped forward, eyes blazing. "You think you're the victim here. You had freedom, Emily. No expectations, no pressure, no responsibilities. You should thank us." "Thank you," I said quietly, "for teaching me what not to become." Her smirk wavered. "You always were dramatic." I looked at her, really looked past the confidence, past the arrogance. There was exhaustion there, fear, maybe even shame. But she hid it quickly. "Dad would never have trusted you with the company," she said, voice rising. "He knew you couldn't handle it." I took a slow breath. Maybe he didn't want me to handle the company. Maybe he wanted me to handle the truth. For a moment, no one spoke. Then the doorbell rang. My mother flinched. Victoria frowned. Who could that be? I didn't move. The housekeeper hurried past us, and seconds later, a man stepped into the foyer. He wore a gray suit, rein on his shoulders, a small portfolio in his hand. "Good morning," he said evenly. "I'm here representing Mr. Harold Winters." My mother's composure cracked. "You can't just barge into our home." He held up a hand. "I have legal authority to deliver this." He opened the portfolio and withdrew a sealed envelope stamped with the emblem of the Lincoln County Court. "These are official copies of William Carter's Amendment B filed under probate law 10 years ago. You are both required to attend a public reading of the will tomorrow at 10 a.m. Victoria's mouth fell open. "Public reading, yes," he said. "At the Carter Instruments headquarters in Portland. Attendance is mandatory for all named heirs." My mother took a step back. "This is absurd. My husband's estate was settled years ago." "Apparently not," he said politely. "Mr. Winters has ensured every document is verified and notarized." He looked at me, then his expression softening. "Miss Carter, you'll want to bring your copy." When he left, the silence returned heavier than before. My mother sank into the nearest chair, her perfectly manicured hands trembling. "Your father was supposed to leave things simple," she murmured. "Maybe he finally decided to make them right," I said. Victoria paced the room, fury building in her steps. "You think you've won something? You think a few papers make you one of us?" "I don't want to be one of you," I said quietly. "I just want the truth." She turned to me, her voice shaking. "You don't know what you're starting." "Maybe not," I said. "But I know how it ends. Dad made sure of that." Her jaw tightened. "You won't humiliate us in public." "It's not humiliation," I said. "It's justice." "You always were self-righteous," she hissed. "A martyr in cheap shoes." "And you," I said calmly, "were always afraid of losing control." Her hand trembled around her glass the same way my father's had that night at the party. My mother finally looked up at me, tears forming but never falling. "Please, Emily," she said softly. "Don't do this. Think about what the press will say. Think about our name." "I have," I said, "and for once I'm not ashamed of it." I turned to leave the folder tucked under my arm. Victoria's voice followed me through the hall. "You'll regret this." I stopped at the door and looked back. Maybe, but I've spent my whole life regretting silence. I'm ready to try something else. Outside, the wind whipped against my coat, the air thick with the scent of salt and rain. The mansion behind me stood quiet, like it was holding its breath. Tomorrow would change everything. For them, for me, for the Carter name my father had tried so hard to cleanse. As I walked toward my car, lightning flashed over the water, illuminating the sky in quick bursts. I thought of my father's letter, "The truth can no longer wait." Tomorrow it wouldn't have to. The boardroom of Carter Instruments had always felt like a church built to worship money. The walls were lined with framed patents, the kind that turned inventions into fortunes. The long walnut table gleamed beneath the fluorescent lights, and in the center sat a crystal bowl of white roses, their scent too clean, too controlled. I'd been there once as a child when my father gave a presentation to his investors. I remembered the way he'd looked at the room back then with pride and exhaustion, as if success was a weight he carried alone. Now, decades later, I stood in that same room, but this time I carried something heavier. The board members filed in one by one, murmuring greetings that sounded more like rehearsed apologies. Victoria entered last, her heels sharp against the floor, her expression calm but brittle. My mother followed her, wearing pearls and a mask of composure. They didn't look at me. At the far end of the table, Harold Winters adjusted his glasses and opened a leather briefcase. The sound of papers sliding free silenced the room. "Good morning," he began. "We're gathered today for the formal reading and presentation of William Carter's Amendment B, as outlined in his updated will dated March 5, 10 years ago." His voice was steady, every syllable deliberate. "All relevant parties are present. This session is being recorded under the authority of the probate court." A ripple of unease passed through the room. Victoria leaned toward her lawyer, whispering something sharp. My mother's fingers tightened around her purse strap. I sat near the end of the table, the letter from my father folded neatly in front of me like a compass, pointing towards something I couldn't yet see. "Harold," continued Mr. Carter's original estate division granted majority control of Carter Instruments and associated properties to Mrs. Sylvia Carter and Miss Victoria Carter. However, Amendment B modifies those terms substantially. He glanced toward me, his expression unreadable. It introduces a new clause effective upon any attempt to exclude Emily Carter from her rightful inheritance or involvement in the family's charitable entities. Victoria scoffed. "This is absurd," she said. "My father never would have changed the structure without consulting the board." Harold smiled slightly. "He did consult the board. You just didn't know it. He filed the changes through a separate trust, the Harmony Trust." Her face paled. "The what?" "The Harmony Trust," Harold repeated. "Created for the purpose of ensuring that the Carter legacy included service, not just profit." My mother spoke for the first time. "Mr. Winters, I must object. My husband was ill in his final months. He wasn't thinking clearly." Harold nodded slowly. "That's an important claim, Mrs. Carter. Which is why your husband left a recorded statement confirming his sound mind at the time of signing." The room froze. "I have that recording here." Harold continued, pulling a small drive from his case. "Would anyone like to dispute its validity before I play it?" No one spoke. He connected the drive to the screen mounted on the wall. The lights dimmed automatically, and the image flickered to life, a video of my father, older but unmistakably alert. His gray hair was neatly combed, his voice clear. "If you're watching this," he said, "it means my wishes are being challenged. It also means my fears about this family were correct." My mother gasped softly. Victoria looked like she'd stopped breathing. "I built Carter Instruments for innovation," he went on, "but I watched it become a mirror for pride. My daughters, my wife, you've mistaken wealth for worth. I cannot take that illusion with me." He paused, his gaze steady even through the years between us. "To my eldest daughter, Emily, you've been called useless, soft, naive. I called you that once too, and it shames me. You were the only one who understood what legacy truly means." The room was silent except for the soft hum of the speakers. My throat burned. "To my younger daughter, Victoria, my father continued, your ambition is remarkable, but without conscience it will destroy everything. I hope one day you'll see that empire without empathy is just a tomb built out of marble and greed." Victoria stood abruptly. "Turn it off." "No," Harold said calmly. "We will let him finish." My father's image straightened slightly. "This amendment assigns full oversight of the Carter Foundation to Emily Carter effective immediately, upon any act of exclusion or manipulation from the remaining heirs. All charitable funds, real estate, and intellectual property related to the foundation will be transferred to her control under the supervision of the Harmony Trust." If she declines, the assets will convert to public domain and cease to exist under the Carter name. Victoria's lawyer rose. We protest this amendment. There's no evidence it was legally filed. There's every evidence, Harold said, producing stamped copies. Filed with the state office on March 7th, witnessed by 2 notaries and a judge. You may confirm it through the court's digital archive. The lawyer's mouth opened, then closed. My father's recorded voice continued. To my wife Sylvia, I loved you more than you believed. But love doesn't mean silence. You taught our daughters to fear imperfection, and in doing so, you taught them to fear themselves. This clause is not revenge, it is restoration. The screen went black. The silence afterward was so deep it felt physical. My mother stood slowly, her voice trembling. This isn't right. He wasn't supposed to. He didn't mean. Harold folded his hands. He meant every word, Mrs. Carter. And the court has verified its authenticity. Victoria turned to me, fury shaking her voice. You think this makes you some kind of hero? You think Dad suddenly decided you were special? I didn't answer. She took a step closer, her heels clicking like gunshots on the marble. You always wanted to play the martyr, didn't you? Well, congratulations. You finally got your stage. I didn't ask for any of this, I said quietly. Liar, she spat. You've been waiting your whole life to prove you're better than me. I never wanted to be better, I said. Just equal. She laughed bitterly. You equal to me, please. You're a school teacher. I run a corporation. I met her gaze. Then maybe it's time you learn who's really running it. Harold cleared his throat. Miss Carter, as per the terms of the amendment, your sister will assume immediate authority over the Carter Foundation. That includes access to company records and financial audits for the past 10 years. Victoria froze. Audits, yes, Harold said. Your father instructed that all charity-related expenses be reviewed for transparency. She looked toward her mother, panic breaking through the mask. Mom. But my mother didn't speak. She just stared at the floor, her knuckles white against her purse strap. I stood the folder in my hands. I'm not here to take what isn't mine, I said. I'm here to make sure what's his doesn't get destroyed. Harold nodded approvingly. Well said. One of the board members, a man I vaguely remembered from my childhood, cleared his throat. If this is valid, then it's the law. William Carter's will stands. The board recognizes Emily Carter as the acting trustee. Victoria's face went white. You can't be serious. It's not a matter of choice, he said gently. It's compliance. The meeting ended in fragments, papers shuffling, chairs scraping, whispered outrage. My mother left first, avoiding my eyes. Victoria stayed long enough to lean close and hiss. Enjoy your little victory. You won't last a week. I watched her leave, heels clicking down the hall like thunder fading into distance. When the room emptied, Harold placed a hand on my shoulder. You did well. I didn't do anything I said. You showed up, he replied. That's more than they expected. Through the glass wall of the boardroom, I could see the city skyline rising above the gray river. For years, that view had represented everything I'd been denied. Now it just looked like a promise I hadn't asked for. Harold packed his papers, but before leaving, he turned back. One more thing, he said. Your father mentioned something called Addendum C. He said it would find you when you were ready. What's in it? I asked. He smiled faintly. He didn't tell me. Only that it would make the truth impossible to ignore. As he walked away, I stood there alone, my reflection staring back from the glass. Somewhere deep inside, fear tangled with something new, resolve. For the first time in my life, they couldn't erase me, and the truth, whatever it was, had only just begun to speak. The courthouse smelled faintly of old paper and disinfectant. My shoes clicked against the marble floor as I followed Harold down the long corridor toward courtroom 3. Every step felt like walking into a memory I didn't belong to. My palms were damp, the leather folder pressed tight against my chest. Behind the double doors waited the same people who'd spent their lives pretending I was invisible. My mother, my sister, their lawyer, and a dozen reporters waiting to watch the Carter family eat itself alive. Harold stopped at the door. Stay calm, he said quietly. Truth does the shouting for you. I nodded, though my stomach twisted like a knot. When we stepped inside, the buzz of whispers filled the room. My mother sat at the defendant's table, pearls gleaming under the fluorescent lights, eyes red but defiant. Victoria was beside her, posture, perfect, expression unreadable. She looked like a woman trying to hold her empire together with sheer pride. Across the aisle, journalists whispered into their phones, scribbling in notebooks. The judge, a woman with silver hair and steady eyes, banged her gavel once. Court is in session. This hearing concerns the validity of Amendment B to the William Carter estate. Her gaze moved to me. Miss Emily Carter, as the primary beneficiary of the amendment, are you ready to proceed? My throat was dry. Yes, Your Honor. The lawyer for my mother and sister, a tall man in a navy suit named Charles DeWitt, stood first. Your Honor, the plaintiffs, Mrs. Sylvia Carter and Miss Victoria Carter, contend that Amendment B is fraudulent. It was filed by a dismissed attorney using forged signatures for the purpose of redirecting assets. Harold rose slowly, buttoning his jacket. Your Honor, the document was signed, witnessed, and filed legally with state records. Furthermore, we have video evidence of Mr. Carter confirming the amendment himself. Charles smirked. A video, anyone can manipulate recordings these days. Not notarized ones, Harold said, sliding a flash drive across the table. This one was certified by the State Archives Office. The judge raised an eyebrow. Proceed. The bailiff connected the drive to the courtroom screen. The lights dimmed. Then, just as it had in the boardroom, my father appeared, alive in motion and sound, though 10 years gone. His voice filled the room, low and deliberate. If this amendment is being questioned, he said, it means my family has once again chosen pride over purpose. A few people in the courtroom gasped softly. My mother's hand shot to her chest. Victoria stared at the screen, frozen. I created Carter Instruments to build, not to hoard, my father's voice continued. If my wife and younger daughter are watching this, understand that legacy is not measured by what you keep, but by what you give. He paused, his eyes shifting directly toward the camera. Even through the flickering video, it felt like he was looking right at us. To Emily, he said, you carry the part of me that still believes in creation over conquest. I am leaving you authority to protect what matters most, the soul of this family's name. The room was silent. Even the journalists had stopped typing. Then my mother's voice broke the stillness. That's enough, she said, standing. He wasn't in his right mind. He'd been sick for months. Harold didn't flinch. Your Honor, we have medical certification from Dr. Emerson, dated the day of signing, confirming full cognitive health. Charles jumped up. This is an ambush. The judge raised her hand. Sit down, Mr. DeWitt. On screen, my father continued, speaking, his tone sharpening. If they try to silence her again, activate the truth clause. Every lie will undo itself. The video ended. The lights flickered back on. The judge looked at both tables. Well, she said, that's rather definitive. My mother trembled in her seat, but her lawyer wasn't done. Your Honor, even if this recording is genuine, it doesn't specify the terms of the clause. Harold smiled slightly. It will once we open Addendum C. He pulled a sealed document from his briefcase and placed it on the table. Victoria's voice finally cracked. You can't keep doing this. You're destroying our family's reputation. Harold turned to her. Miss Carter, your father destroyed nothing. He merely revealed the truth you've been hiding. She glared at him. You think you understand this family? You're just an old man cashing in on secrets. He met her eyes calmly. Secrets pay poorly. Truth, however, never loses value. The judge gestured. Mr. Winters, please proceed with Addendum C. He broke the seal and unfolded the pages. His voice filled the room as he read. Article 7, the Truth Clause. Should any member of this family attempt to misrepresent, withhold, or manipulate the financial integrity of the Carter Foundation, that members' shares and privileges will be forfeited immediately and transferred to the one who acted with honesty. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. My heart hammered. Harold continued. Additionally, the court and state auditors will have unrestricted access to 10 years of financial records. Victoria shot up from her chair. This is a setup, she shouted. You're twisting his words. Sit down, Miss Carter, the judge said sharply. I won't. He's making me look like a criminal. Harold raised a brow. Then perhaps you should have read the ledgers before you signed them. That silenced her. I turned toward her slowly, realizing something I hadn't before. She wasn't just angry, she was scared. The judge leaned forward. Mr. Winters, is there evidence of mismanagement? Yes, Your Honor, Harold said, sliding a folder toward her. Financial records show unauthorized withdrawals from the foundation accounts totaling over $1.2 million, transferred to an entity called VCL Holdings, registered under Miss Victoria Carter's name. The room erupted in whispers. Cameras clicked. Victoria's lawyer tried to speak, but she raised her voice over him. That was a temporary reallocation. A strategic investment. Harold's tone stayed even. A transfer from a charity fund to a private investment firm. How strategic. My mother's face went white. Victoria, please tell me that isn't true. I did it for us, Victoria said, turning to her. You told me to keep the company growing. You said appearances mattered more than paperwork. Enough, the judge said, slamming the gavel once. The documents will speak for themselves. Victoria sank back into her chair, shaking. My mother covered her face with trembling hands. I sat frozen, the noise around me fading into a low hum. I'd spent my entire life being told I was the embarrassment, the failure. Now, in a single morning, the truth had flipped the story completely. When the judge finally spoke, her voice was calm but heavy. Given the evidence presented, the court recognizes the validity of Amendment B and Addendum C, effective immediately. Oversight of the Carter Foundation is transferred to Emily Carter. The sound that followed wasn't applause, it was silence. The kind that feels holy. Victoria didn't move. My mother looked like the air had been punched from her lungs. Harold gathered the papers neatly. Your father's wishes are fulfilled, he said quietly. The judge adjourned the hearing and the crowd began to scatter. As I stood to leave, Victoria's voice cut through the murmurs. You think this is over, she said. Her eyes were red, but her tone was sharp again. You'll never survive what comes next. You don't know how to lead. I met her gaze. Maybe not. But I know how to start over. That's something you never learned. I turned and walked toward the door, my heels echoing across the floor. Reporters called after me, flashbulbs flickering, but I didn't stop. Harold caught up beside me as we stepped into the hallway. You handled that beautifully, he said. I didn't handle anything, I murmured. Truth did. He smiled faintly. That's what your father believed. Truth always arrives just later than we hope. Outside, the sky had cleared, the sunlight sharp and cold against the courthouse steps. I stood there for a long time, folder still in my hands, the weight of generations pressing on my shoulders, and yet, for the first time, it didn't crush me. When I finally looked at Harold, I managed a small smile. It's over. He shook his head gently. No, Emily. This was just the trial. The real test is what you do with the freedom he gave you. And as the wind swept across the square, carrying the sound of distant waves, I realized he was right. Justice wasn't the end of the story. It was the beginning of one I'd have to write myself. That night I couldn't sleep. The courtroom still echoed in my head. My father's recorded voice, Victoria's shouting, the judge's gavel like thunder striking the truth into place. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling of my apartment, the leather folder still on the nightstand. Justice had come, but peace hadn't followed. There was still a piece missing, something my father wanted me to find. At 3 a.m, I got up, poured myself a glass of water, and opened the folder again. Between the court documents and sealed pages of Amendment B, I noticed a small note I hadn't seen before. It was written in my father's handwriting, tucked into the lining of the folder like a secret whisper. Emily, when you've proven your strength, look beneath what you think you've won. The truth sleeps there. I didn't understand it at first. But Harold's words from earlier that day replayed in my mind. Your father mentioned something called Addendum C. He said it would find you when you were ready. That letter wasn't the end. It was another beginning. By morning, I was sitting in Harold's office again, coffee going cold between us. He left me another note, I said, sliding the slip of paper across his desk. Something about finding what I've already won. He studied it, brow furrowing. He's talking about the foundation, he said. When the transfer went through yesterday, you inherited more than the title. There's an archive files your father kept off record. It's locked at the old research facility in Beaverton. He used to call it his listening room. The listening room, I repeated. He said it's where he kept things worth hearing. 2 hours later, we were on the road. The drive was long and quiet, the fog curling through the trees like memory. When we reached the facility, it looked abandoned, dusty windows, faded signage, a lock rusted by time. Harold handed me a key. Your father told me to give you this when you were ready. He said you'd know why. The lock gave way easily as if it had been waiting for me. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of old metal and varnish. The place looked frozen in time, workbenches covered in blueprints, shelves lined with instruments, and a piano in the corner draped with a sheet. I walked slowly, my footsteps echoing through the empty space. On the far wall hung a framed photo of my father and me when I was 10. He was kneeling beside a half-built violin, his hand resting on my shoulder. I'd forgotten that day. Until now, the sound of sawdust crunching under my shoes, the way he'd said music is just math with emotion. Near the photo was a cabinet marked Archive 7C. The same phrase from his last note, look beneath what you've won. My pulse quickened. Harold, I said, does that number mean anything to you? He smiled faintly. 7C was your father's favorite tuning key, but he also used it for one of his safety boxes. Try the bottom drawer. I knelt, pulling it open. Inside was a single sealed envelope, the edges yellowed with age. On the front, my father had written for Emily. When the music finally stops, my hands trembled as I tore it open. Inside was a letter and a USB drive. The letter read, "You've done what I couldn't. You've made truth louder than pride. But before you move forward, you must know what silence cost us. The company you see today was built on more than innovation, it was built on compromise. Your mother and sister were not the only ones who forgot what mattered. I did too. And this drive will show you what I tried to hide. If you understand after watching it, forgive me." I looked at Harold. He said he was hiding something. What could it be? Harold sighed. Your father was a complicated man. He kept things locked away because he believed timing mattered more than truth. I stared at the USB drive. Then I guess it's time. We found an old laptop on one of the workbenches. The screen flickered to life, faintly humming. The drive loaded a video file named The Beginning. My father appeared again, but not the calm version from the courtroom video. He looked younger, tired, his face drawn by guilt. If you're watching this, Emily, he said softly, then I've failed twice, once as a father, once as a man. The first Carter Foundation project began as a tax shelter. We used it to hide profits, not to help people. I allowed it. I signed every form. Your mother told me it was just business. I believed her until I met the children at the hospital in Portland, the ones our company promised to sponsor. The funds never reached them. They canceled the program because of our greed. I felt the air leave my lungs. My father's voice trembled. I rebuilt the foundation from the ground up after that. Every charity, every donation, those were my penance. But by then, Victoria had already started cutting corners, manipulating funds. Your mother told her that's how success worked. I wanted to fix it quietly. I wanted to protect you from what this family had become. But maybe protecting you meant keeping you blind. Harold's hand rested gently on the desk. He was confessing, he said quietly. My father's image looked down, his eyes glistening. You once told me that art heals. You were right. You healed me, Emily. You reminded me that worth isn't in profit but in people. I just hope you can take what I built and make it honest again. The video ended. I sat still for a long moment, the silence heavy and human. "He tried to fix it," I whispered. "He really did." "He did," Harold said. "But now it's your turn." I walked to the piano in the corner and pulled off the dusty sheet. The wood gleamed faintly in the dim light. When I pressed a key, it responded with a soft, imperfect note, one that wavered before settling into something steady. Harold stood behind me. "He left you everything you need," he said. I nodded slowly. "He also left me everything he was ashamed of." "That's how inheritance works," Harold replied. "It's never just the good parts." I stayed in that room until sunset. I opened the drawers one by one, finding sketches of instruments, newspaper clippings about children's hospitals, letters he never mailed. Each one was a fragment of a man trying to make peace with himself. When I finally walked out, the air outside smelled of pine and rain. The facility stood quiet behind me, but I could feel my father's voice in the wind. For years I'd carried his silence like a wound. Now I understood it wasn't silence. It was waiting. As Harold locked the door, he turned to me. "What will you do with what you found?" "I'll rebuild it," I said. "Not just the foundation, the truth." He smiled faintly. That's exactly what he hoped you'd say. We drove back toward the coast in silence, the sunset bleeding gold through the clouds. I looked out the window and thought about my father's words. "If you understand after watching it, forgive me." I whispered into the fading light, "I do." The wind carried the answer somewhere I couldn't see. But for the first time in years, the weight on my chest felt lighter, as if forgiveness itself had learned to breathe again. The next morning, my phone wouldn't stop buzzing. Missed calls, messages, news alerts. By the time I opened one, my breath caught. Every headline screamed the same thing: Carter Instruments under investigation for misuse of charity funds. A photo of Victoria outside the courthouse flashed across the screen, her eyes wide, lips tight, the mask of confidence gone. The world had found out. I stood by the window, the ocean glimmering gray under the morning Sunday. Harold had warned me it might come to this. When truth moves, he'd said, it doesn't whisper, it roars. By 8 a.m., the foundation's PR director was on the line. "Emily, we're getting flooded with press requests. The board wants to know if you'll issue a statement." I hesitated. "What about my family?" "They're not answering," she said. "But the auditors have already confirmed the transfers. The court's frozen all VCL Holdings accounts." For a moment I couldn't move. I thought of my father's confession, the guilt he carried, the empire he'd tried to save with silence. Maybe this was what he'd meant when he said truth will undo itself. The undoing had begun. At 10, I drove to the Carter estate. The gates were open, the lawn unkept, reporters swarming like crows. Flashes went off as I stepped from the car. "Miss Carter, do you have a comment? Did your sister really steal from disabled children? Will you press charges?" I pushed through without answering, my heartbeat louder than the questions. Inside the house was chaos. Boxes, half-packed drawers, yanked open, the smell of perfume and panic. My mother sat on the edge of the staircase, her phone in her lap, her hands trembling. "Emily," she whispered when she saw me. "They're saying awful things on the news. They've frozen the accounts. We can't even pay the staff." "Where's Victoria?" I asked. Her gaze dropped. "Upstairs. She's been locked in her room since dawn." I walked up the steps slowly. The door to Victoria's room was half open, her voice low and frantic on the phone. "You told me it was fine, Lawrence. You said the audit would never reach the foundation accounts." A pause, then a sharp hiss of breath. "Don't you dare hang up on me." She slammed the phone down and spun toward me. Her eyes were rimmed red, her face pale against the morning light. "What do you want?" she said, voice cracking. "To talk." "You got what you wanted," she snapped. "Congratulations. You're the saint, I'm the thief." "I didn't ask for any of this," I said quietly. "But we can't fix it by pretending it's not happening." She laughed bitterly. "Fix it? You think you can fix this? The company's reputation is gone. The investors are pulling out. Mom's friends won't even answer her calls. They all think I'm a monster." I looked at her, really looked. This wasn't the woman who'd smirked from marble staircases or strutted through boardrooms. This was someone stripped bare. "Did you do it?" I asked softly. Her jaw tightened. "It wasn't supposed to be like that. I just redirected funds for a short time. I was going to pay it back, but you didn't." Her voice rose. "I was trying to save the company by stealing from children." She flinched as if I'd struck her. For a moment the fight left her. "You don't understand the pressure, Emily. Dad made me believe I was the only one who could carry his legacy. And Mom, she needed everything to look perfect. I couldn't fail. Not like you did." I stepped closer. "Failing isn't falling, Victoria. It's refusing to get back up." Her shoulders shook. "They're going to arrest me, aren't they?" "Not if we make it right," I said. "Dad's amendment gave the foundation independence. I can use that to repair the damage, but only if you cooperate." She sank onto the edge of her bed, staring at her hands. "And if I don't, then the court will handle it. And they won't be kind." Downstairs, the front door burst open. Harold stepped in, followed by 2 auditors and a court officer. My mother rose to her feet, pale as porcelain. "You can't just barge in here. We have authorization," Harold said gently, showing her the court order. "It's standard procedure for a full financial seizure pending investigation." She looked ready to faint. "This is humiliating." "It's justice," Harold said simply. Victoria came down the stairs, slowly, eyes hollow. The auditors began cataloging boxes, documents, hard drives. One of them whispered to another, "This place looks like a museum for guilt." My mother turned on me. "Are you happy now? You've destroyed us." I shook my head. "No, Mom. You destroyed yourselves the day you decided reputation mattered more than truth." Tears welled in her eyes, but she said nothing. When the auditors left, the house felt emptier than ever. Harold stood beside me by the doorway. "It's begun," he said. "They'll lose the mansion, the cars, the accounts, all assets tied to misused funds." "They'll have nothing," I whispered. He looked at me carefully. "You don't sound proud of that." "I'm not," I said. "I just wish it hadn't come to this." That evening, as the sun bled orange across the sea, I sat in the study, the same room where my father once toasted Victoria's success. Dust covered the piano, the champagne stains still marked the carpet. I opened one of the drawers and found a stack of old family photos, my mother smiling in a white dress, my father holding me as a baby, Victoria's graduation day. Everything looked perfect, almost holy. Harold's voice broke the silence. "He tried to warn them, you know. He told your mother that arrogance would be the family's undoing." "I know," I said softly. "He just didn't live long enough to see it." He studied me for a moment. "There's one last matter," he said. "The media will want a statement. They're painting you as the hero, the one who saved the Carter legacy." I looked at the photos again, my throat tightening. "There are no heroes here, Harold. Just people learning the cost of their lies." The phone on the desk rang. I answered, expecting another journalist. But it was Victoria. Her voice was small, shaking. "Emily, they're charging me. The lawyers say I could face prison." I closed my eyes. "I'm sorry. I don't want your pity," she said. Mom's sick. The stress, it's too much. Please don't let them take the house. At least not yet." I sat there in silence, listening to her breathe. The same sister who once laughed at me was now asking for mercy. And the truth was, I still loved her. No matter what she'd done, she was part of the same broken family my father had tried to fix. "I'll see what I can do," I said finally. "Thank you," she whispered. Then almost too softly to hear, "I'm sorry." After the call ended, I stared out the window until the sky turned black. Justice had been served, but it didn't feel like victory. It felt like a requiem, one final chord in a song too heavy to carry. Harold came to the doorway. "You okay?" I nodded. She called. "She's scared." "She should be," he said, then paused. "What will you do?" "Exactly what Dad would have wanted," I said. "Turn this wreckage into something that means something." He smiled faintly. That's what makes you different, Emily. You don't just win. You heal. Outside the wind howled against the cliffs. I thought of my father's letter, the one that started it all. The truth can no longer wait. It had waited long enough. And now it was up to me to decide what came after the truth, justice, or forgiveness. The call came just after midnight. I had been staring at the ceiling, listening to the waves crash against the rocks outside my apartment, when my phone lit up with a number I almost didn't recognize. Victoria's voice trembled on the other end. "Emily," she said, barely above a whisper. "They've frozen everything. The lawyers say Mom's medical insurance is suspended until the accounts are released. She's having chest pains. I don't know what to do." For a moment I didn't answer. I stared at the shadows on the wall, the soft hum of my father's old pocket watch ticking from the nightstand. I thought of the courtroom, the confession, the headlines, and the gavel that sealed their fate. Then I thought of my mother, frail and terrified, sitting in that big empty house that once stood for power. "Where is she now?" I asked. "At the hospital," Victoria said. "They're running tests, but she's scared. She keeps asking for you." The next morning I drove to St. Luke's Hospital in Portland. The sky was a heavy gray, the kind that pressed down on everything beneath it. When I walked into the room, the smell of antiseptics stung my nose. My mother looked small beneath the white sheets, her skin pale, her hair flattened against the pillow. For a moment she didn't see me. Then her eyes fluttered open. "Emily," she whispered, "you came." I nodded, setting my coat on the chair. "Of course I did." Her lips trembled. "I didn't think you would. Not after everything." "Mom," I said quietly, "you're still my mother." Tears filled her eyes. "I tried so hard to make everything perfect. I thought if I kept it polished, the cracks wouldn't show." She reached for my hand. "I failed you. I failed all of us." Victoria stood by the window, her arms wrapped around herself. She looked nothing like the woman who once commanded boardrooms. Her power had drained away, leaving something raw and uncertain. "She's been like this since last night," she said softly. I didn't know who else to call. I looked at her. "You did the right thing." The doctor came and checked vitals, murmured something about stress-induced arrhythmia, then left us alone. The beeping of the heart monitor filled the silence. My mother turned to me again. "Emily, I know I can't fix the past, but if there's any way, please don't let this destroy our family." I hesitated. "Dad's will had one more clause," I said finally. "Something called the humility provision. I didn't understand it before, but now I think I do." Victoria frowned. "Another clause. How many were there?" I looked at her. "Enough to test us." Later that day, I met Harold at his office. He had already pulled the document from his archive, a single page, folded neatly in an envelope stamped with my father's seal. He adjusted his glasses and began reading aloud. Article 9, the humility provision. "Should any beneficiary cause harm to another through deceit or coercion, they shall forfeit their inheritance. However, if the wronged heir chooses mercy, all forfeited assets will be transferred into a joint trust to be used solely for public good." I sat back in the chair, the words ringing in my head. "So if I forgive them," Harold nodded, "you'd redirect everything into a community trust. The house, the assets, the shares. It would mean giving up control. And if I don't, then the law will seize what's left. They'll have nothing." The thought made my chest tighten. For months I had wanted justice, but now, with the power in my hands, all I felt was exhaustion. Harold watched me carefully. "Your father believed that mercy completes justice," he said gently. "He trusted you to know the difference." That evening I returned to the hospital. Victoria was asleep in the chair beside Mom's bed. I stood there for a long moment, watching them breathe in rhythm, mother and daughter, two people who had spent their lives running from humility. I thought about Dad's voice in that final video. "This clause is not revenge. It is restoration." When Victoria stirred, I spoke quietly. "There's a way to fix this." She blinked up at me, her eyes swollen. "What do you mean I can activate the clause?" "But it comes with conditions. You and Mom will work for the Carter Harmony Foundation for 2 years. No title, no salary beyond what the law allows. Every hour will go to rebuilding what you broke." Victoria looked at me like I'd spoken another language. "You'd let us, I'm not letting you," I said. "I'm giving you a chance." She covered her face with her hands. "I don't deserve it. Neither did the people we hurt," I said. "But mercy isn't about who deserves it." When Mom woke later, I explained the same thing. She cried quietly, holding my hand like it was an anchor. "You're your father's child," she whispered. "He'd be proud of you." By the end of the week, Harold filed the legal transfer. The court approved it under the clause's terms. The mansion, the cars, the investments, all liquidated into what was now called the Carter Harmony Trust. The next Monday, we gathered at the foundation building. The air smelled of fresh paint and new beginnings. Mom wore a simple cardigan. Victoria stood beside her, clutching a folder labeled Volunteer Orientation. The staff watched curiously as I stepped up to the podium. Today, I said, we start again, not as heirs or executives, but as servants to something greater than ourselves. This foundation was built on our father's vision to create harmony through compassion. For too long, we used it to serve our pride. From this day forward, it will serve people. Applause broke the heavy silence. I glanced at Victoria, who was blinking hard, fighting tears. Afterward, we toured the children's wing. The walls were covered in bright murals, painted by volunteers' sunsets, birds' laughter frozen in color. A little boy ran up to Victoria, tugging at her sleeve. "Are you the lady who makes the music?" he asked. She looked down, startled. "Not yet," she said softly, kneeling beside him. "But I'm learning." Harold stood beside me, his voice low. "Your father would have liked that answer." Maybe, I said. But I think he'd like what comes next even more. When the day ended, I found myself back at the piano in the foundation's hall. The same instrument from his workshop had been restored, polished, tuned. I sat there pressing one key. The note rang clear, echoing through the empty space. Victoria walked in quietly, her sleeves rolled up, smudges of paint on her hands. "You still play when you think too much," she said. "Some things never change," I replied. She stood beside me. "Emily, thank you for not letting this end the way it could have." I looked at her, the sister who once called me useless, who now looked fragile but real. "Don't thank me," I said. "Thank Dad. He wrote the music. I just learned to follow the rhythm." Outside, the sky was turning gold. Mom waited by the door, a gentle smile breaking through the lines of worry. She reached for Victoria's hand, then mine. For the first time in years, we stood together, 3 women from the same family, finally facing the same direction. As the last rays of light filled the room, I whispered under my breath, "This is what he wanted." Harold's voice echoed from behind us. "No," he said softly. "This is what you built. He only left the notes. You turned them into harmony." And for the first time since all of it began, I believed him. 6 months later, the air around the Carter Harmony Center smelled like fresh paint and sunlight. Spring had found its way into everything. The gardens, the laughter of children, even the old walls that used to hold nothing but business meetings and pride. Now the building pulsed with color and sound. The grand lobby, once lined with portraits of executives, was covered in murals painted by kids with messy hands and brighter imaginations. Every brushstroke felt like a resurrection. I arrived early that morning, unlocking the doors before the volunteers came in. The halls were quiet, except for the faint hum of a piano somewhere down the corridor. It was Victoria. Her sleeves were rolled up, her hair tied back, and she was teaching 3 children how to tap rhythm on the keys. "Good, Macy," she said softly. "You don't have to rush. Music isn't a race." I stood in the doorway watching her. There was no trace of the woman who once strutted through boardrooms in designer heels. She wore a faded foundation t-shirt, her hands smudged with paint. One of the kids looked up and giggled. "Miss Victoria, you missed a spot," pointing to a streak of blue across her cheek. She laughed, a real unguarded laugh. I hadn't heard that sound since we were teenagers. When she saw me, she waved. "You're early," she said. "So are you." She shrugged. Guess the useless one's not the only early riser anymore. The words were gentle this time, almost teasing. I smiled. I'll take that as progress. She leaned on the piano, catching her breath. You know, I didn't think I could do this. The first few weeks I kept checking my phone like I was waiting for a board meeting that would never come. And now she looked at the children. Now I get it. I see what Dad meant. Building lives, not empires. Across the hall, my mother was helping a group of parents set up for the foundation's spring event. She wore simple clothes these days, trading pearls for a soft cardigan. Every Wednesday, she volunteered in the art therapy wing, organizing supplies and making tea for families who stayed through long sessions. People loved her. They didn't know her as Sylvia Carter, the woman from society pages. They just knew her as Miss Sill, the kind lady who remembered their kids' names. I walked over to her, handing her a clipboard. You're running the show again, I said. She smiled, eyes bright. Some habits die hard, but this time I'm not running it for applause. Dad would have loved this, I said. Her expression softened. He'd have loved what you turned it into. At noon, the Harmony Center's courtyard filled with guests for our one-year celebration. The city mayor came along with parents, teachers, donors, and volunteers. A string of banners fluttered in the breeze, 1 year of music, 1 year of healing. Children ran between tables carrying cupcakes and paintbrushes. It wasn't elegant like the Carter galas of old, but it was alive. Harold arrived just before the speeches began, leaning on his cane, but still walking tall. You've built something remarkable, he said as he joined me on stage. Your father would call this his proudest invention. I shook my head. He'd say it was all yours. Harold smiled. No. He left blueprints. You built the music. When it was time to speak, I stepped up to the microphone. The crowd hushed. I looked around at the faces, parents, children, even my mother and sister standing together near the front. A year ago I began this building was a monument to pride. Today it's a home for hope. We've learned something. My father always believed that success means nothing without significance. I told them about the programs. We'd started the music therapy sessions in local hospitals, the scholarships for underprivileged kids, the summer camp we'd opened at the old Hampton estate. The mention of the estate drew a murmur from the crowd. It used to be our family's vacation home, I said. Now it's a place where children who've never seen the ocean can touch the waves for the first time. When the applause faded, I gestured to my mother and sister. This foundation isn't just about my father's dream, it's about redemption. It's about learning that forgiveness can build more than anger ever could. Victoria stepped forward, then taking the microphone. For a long time, I thought strength meant winning, she said. But I've learned that real strength is showing up for others when no one's watching. My sister taught me that. She turned to me, smiling through tears. You gave me a chance when I didn't deserve one, and you changed me. The audience clapped softly, touched by her honesty. My mother joined us, her hand trembling as she reached for mine. And you changed me too, she said. You reminded me what love looks like when it isn't dressed in pride. I looked at the two of them, so different, yet finally standing on the same side of something true. For the first time in my life, our family felt whole. That evening, after the guests left, we stayed behind to clean up. The courtyard was quiet now, only the glow of string lights and the soft chirp of crickets filling the air. My mother packed leftover food for the families who couldn't afford dinner. Victoria wiped paint off the tables, humming under her breath. I sat at the piano inside the hall, letting my fingers drift across the keys. The melody that came out was slow, tender, familiar. Victoria joined me on the bench. What's that one? Something I started years ago, I said. Never finished it. Play it again, she whispered. This time I'll listen. We played together for the first time, her awkwardly hitting the wrong keys, me correcting her softly. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. When the last note faded, she exhaled. That's the sound of peace, she said. I nodded. No. That's the sound of forgiveness. The next morning, we launched the Harmony Scholarship Fund, our biggest project yet. 50 children from across the state were given free access to art and music education. The press called it the Carter Rebirth, but I didn't care about headlines anymore. All I cared about were the letters that arrived from parents, handwritten and full of gratitude. One came from a mother in Salem whose daughter had severe autism. She wrote, "My child spoke her first words through music. You gave her a voice. You gave us hope." I pinned that letter to my office wall beside my father's photo. Harold stopped by that afternoon, smiling as he read the note. "You did it," he said. "Not yet," I said. "We've just started." He chuckled. "You sound like your father." I looked at the photo. Maybe I finally understand him. Later, my mother and Victoria joined me in the garden behind the center. The sunset painted the sky in streaks of rose and gold. The children from the music class ran through the grass, their laughter ringing like wind chimes. My mother looked out at them, eyes wet. "He'd be proud," she said. "He'd be grateful," I replied. "Because this time the Carter name means something good." Victoria picked a wildflower and tucked it behind her ear. "Do you think people can really change, Emily?" I smiled. "I think people can choose to." The three of us stood there in silence, watching the sky fade into twilight. For years we had lived in the ruins of pride. But now, in the soft hum of children's laughter, I could feel something my father had been chasing his whole life: harmony. When I closed the center that night, I looked back at the glowing windows and whispered, "We did it, Dad. We finally made the music right." And for a brief moment, I swore I heard his voice in the wind, low and gentle, saying, "You were never useless, Emily. You were the song." The waves were calm that evening, rolling in steady, patient rhythm against the shore below the cliffs. I stood on the balcony of the old Carter mansion, no longer a mansion, not really. It had become the Harmony Residence, a home for visiting families whose children received therapy at the foundation. The ballroom where my father once toasted Victoria now hosted art classes. The chandelier still hung above, but its crystals reflected paintbrushes and laughter instead of champagne glasses and pride. I came there often after hours. Something about the place reminded me that redemption could take physical form, that even the coldest walls could warm if the right hands rebuilt them. That night I carried a small box tucked beneath my arm, my father's watch, his letters, and one last note Harold had handed me earlier that day. He'd said, "This one wasn't meant for the court. He wrote it for you, for the day you finally felt at peace." I waited until the sun dropped behind the horizon before I opened it. My father's handwriting filled the page, familiar and gentle. "My dearest Emily, if you're reading this, you've already done what I couldn't. You've turned our family from a fortress into a bridge. I made mistakes out of fear, your mother out of vanity, and your sister out of pressure. You, my quiet one, built something greater than all of us meaning. Never doubt that the world needs gentle strength. Never let success harden you the way it did me. And when you hear the word useless, remember it was always spoken by those who feared purpose." I folded the letter carefully and slipped it into the box with the others. The air smelled like salt and new beginnings. From the lawn below came the sound of children laughing. The summer camp had ended an hour ago, but a few families were still lingering, their kids chasing bubbles through the twilight. I smiled as I watched them. That was the legacy now, not the company, not the penthouse, but this. Inside the hallway, lights glowed soft and warm. My mother was sitting in the lounge with a group of parents serving tea. Her silver hair caught the lamplight as she listened to one mother describe how her child had learned to communicate through painting. Every nod, every smile was genuine. When she caught me watching, she gave me a small, proud wave. Upstairs, Victoria was helping a boy fix a broken violin string. She'd become the program coordinator for music therapy, and she was good at it, patient, kind, transformed. I paused by the doorway as she showed the boy how to tighten the tuning peg. Gently she said, "Don't force it. Music only sounds right when it's treated with care." Her words mirrored something our father once told me in that very same room. When the boy left, she looked up and smiled. "I still don't know how you do it," she said. "Do what carry all of this without breaking?" "I did break," I said softly. "But rebuilding is what saved me." We sat together for a moment, listening to the muffled sounds of laughter from downstairs. "You know," she said, "when this all started, I thought you'd take revenge. You had every right to." "I almost did," I admitted. "But then I realized revenge is just another version of pride. Dad didn't want that. He wanted restoration." She nodded slowly. "You think he's watching us?" I smiled. "He's been watching all along. He just needed us to start listening." Later that night, when the families had gone and the halls grew quiet, I walked down to the garden. The roses my mother planted decades ago had returned, blooming wild and untamed. A small plaque at the base of the fountain read, "William Carter, he built music out of silence." I knelt beside it, setting the small box on the stone edge. "I hope we did it right this time," I whispered. "I hope we made you proud." A soft breeze rustled through the leaves, and for a fleeting moment I swore I could hear the faintest hum, like a single piano note carried by the wind. It wasn't loud or grand, just steady. Enough to remind me that harmony never truly dies, it just changes form. The next morning, the foundation hosted its first anniversary gala, not the kind with sequins and champagne, but one filled with color and sincerity. The city mayor gave a short speech. Teachers shared stories about children who'd found their voices through art. The room overflowed with gratitude, not greed. When it was my turn to speak, I looked around and saw faces that told a different story than the one we used to live: mothers holding their children, volunteers who worked late-night staff who believed in second chances. Even my mother and sister sat near the front, hands clasped, eyes shining. "I used to think inheritance meant wealth," I began. "That it was something you received, not something you built. But I've learned that the greatest inheritance is purpose. My father left us money, but more importantly, he left us a lesson that compassion multiplies faster than profit ever could." I glanced toward the audience. For those who followed our story, you know we were a family broken by pride. But this foundation isn't built on what we lost. It's built on what we found: forgiveness, truth, and the courage to start again. Applause filled the room, soft but steady. I saw Victoria wipe a tear from her cheek, my mother smiling through hers. When I stepped off the stage, Harold met me at the bottom of the stairs. "You've done it," he said, voice thick with emotion. "The cycle ends with you." "Maybe it's not ending," I said. "Maybe it's just changing key." That evening we closed the gala with a song written by the children in the Foundation's program. They called it "The Quietest One," inspired by the story they'd heard about the girl who was once called useless. The lyrics spoke of patience, of second chances, of voices once silenced now finding their tune. As they sang, I felt tears spill freely down my face. Afterward, one of the little girls came up to me, tugging on my sleeve. "Miss Emily," she said shyly, "did you really used to be the useless one?" I knelt down, smiling. "That's what they said. But you're not useless now." "No," I said, brushing a strand of hair from her forehead. "And neither are you." When the last family left and the lights dimmed, I walked through the empty hallways one more time. My reflection glimmered faintly in the polished glass. For so many years I'd walked through rooms like this, feeling invisible. Now I didn't need anyone to see me. I saw myself, outside the ocean stretched endlessly beneath the moonlight. I stood there, breathing in the salt air, the night wind cool against my skin. For the first time, I wasn't haunted by what had been lost. I was at peace with what remained. I pulled out my father's pocket watch and listened to its steady ticking, the same rhythm as the waves below, the same heartbeat that once pulsed through every argument, every silence, every reconciliation. "Time," he used to say, "isn't for forgetting. It's for learning." And I had learned. If you've ever been told that your kindness makes you weak, that your silence makes you small, or that your worth depends on how loudly the world applauds you, remember my story. Strength isn't in the noise you make. It's in the lives you touch quietly. So, if this story found you, if it made you see a little of yourself in me, tell me where you're watching from. Share it with someone who's ever felt unseen. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories about quiet justice family and the kind of revenge that heals instead of hurts. Because sometimes the quietest one in the room is the one who changes everything.